My name is Nicholas White. I'm a photographer based on Dartmoor, and I make work about the land and the ways in which we interact with our natural spaces. I got into photography through a love of the outdoors. My childhood was spent up here on the national park, walking and hiking and camping, and sort of photography was a natural partner for that, and I would sort of find myself documenting various day trips and holidays until I got to sort of 18, where I found that photography was becoming the reason to go out as opposed to merely going out walking. At the time I actually wanted to be a musician. I was a drummer in a thrash metal band, and I was studying music and sound engineering, and had this sort of crisis where I realised I didn't want to do that and I didn't really know where else to turn, and the only other thing I had in my life at that point was photography. I kind of went back 2 years to retake my A-levels through a national diploma in photography at Plymouth College of Art, fell in love with the sort of basic principles of photography, and then that naturally progressed onto the 3-year degree programme at the Arts College. On my diploma I was only ever really interested in pictorial landscape work. I really admired the works of Joe Cornish and Charlie Way, and I was only interested in single images. As I progressed onto the degree, I began thinking more and more about project-led work and how you can sort of document themes within the landscape as opposed to simply just going, look how pretty this is. And it was around that sort of time as well that I was introduced to large format by a technician at the Arts College. And so what I thought would be really interesting is I wanted to take this large format camera back out onto Dartmoor just to see if it changed the way I saw this landscape that I've been walking on since I was a kid. I spent 2 days with it and bought my own setup, and now that's the camera that I'm still using today. It was interesting for me to try and view Dartmoor in a slightly different way as opposed to the more what I would deem as being quite cliche landscape images. Living up on North Dartmoor was it's a heavily militarised area. And the more I was walking up there and hiking up there, I began to notice these little elements of the landscape that had been heavily manipulated by the Ministry of Defence. So I kind of started heading out and documenting these structures and documenting traces of the military, interested in how an area that is so beautiful that has been deemed a national park can have this almost second life as an area that facilitates training for war, and is there beauty in that as well? And I was really into Simon Norfolk at the time, so I think you could probably tell that by looking at some of the work, and that was a 2-year project. So the first year was spent embedded at the Oakhampton battle camp, just making these kind of single images of rooms, dormitories, areas within the army camp, and then that naturally led on to moving out onto the firing ranges of North Dartmoor, of Oakhampton, Woolsworthy and Merivale. There was no portraits. I'd never shot portraits before. I kind of neglected to shoot portraiture all through university. But what it did see me move away from is just shooting views and scenes, and it was I started turning the camera to the floor and to the ground, and so there's images of sort of more the environmental impacts of the military training on Dartmoor paired with a celebration of that military history, because it is a huge part of the cultural heritage of this area, is it's a military area. So there's shots of sort of bullet casings frozen under ice, or demolition craters, or footprints, paired with these weird kind of obscure observation posts that have been blended into the landscape to some extent, but also are totally visible. I finished that work in 2013, graduated. For the 2 years I've been in this bubble of being at Arts College where there's not really any stress. If you can make mistakes, it can go wrong, and you can rectify those mistakes, and you're sort of finding your feet a little bit. People telling me the work was great, and I was having group crit sessions and people were saying, this is brilliant, you need to go and do this now, and then I'd go and do that. And then I graduated and realised that actually not many people really cared about military structures on Dartmoor as much as I first thought that they did. And I kind of found myself a little bit lost, kind of roaming around Dartmoor with a large format camera and not really knowing what I was shooting or why or what for. I jumped at the first opportunity to get any photographic work I could in the area, and I got a job as a retoucher, cutting out women's underwear for a clothing company in Cornwall. And then from there that escalated to another job cutting out football boots for a company in Devon, and I'm not interested in football or women's clothing. Neither of those jobs were totally relevant, but what it did allow me to do is put a foot in the right direction and start working within the industry. Not the right part, but I was still working within the photographic industry. And then from being a retoucher, I then worked on e-commerce photography, photographing the football boots, which then led to me being a commercial and editorial photographer for this sports company, photographing all of their web campaigns for various sports brands. And I did that for maybe 2 to 3 years. During that time that I was stuck in a windowless studio, I began thinking of what's next, what ideas I could explore. And I was suddenly in this position where I had the money coming in to facilitate the creation of new work, but not necessarily the time, and you kind of need both to execute a project. And so I kind of committed to this idea of I'm just going to put away a little bit of cash and then use my available bank holidays, and use all my available sick days to do kind of weekly or fortnightly trips to work on a new project. And there's been this idea that had been floating around for a while, which was this idea of documenting the mountain bothies and the bothy community of the UK. I'd kind of discovered mountain bothies online, researching for kind of walking holidays in Scotland. I'd never been to Scotland, and I was trying to figure out budget, student-friendly ways of going to the Highlands, and discovered bothies, which are these sort of remote, isolated shelters that are unlocked and totally free to use, and you have to carry all your own fuel in, your coal and your firewood and everything, and you can't book it, you never really know what you're going to find, there's no water, there's no electricity. Purely from an outdoors perspective, from an interest in hiking, I was like, well, that's a really interesting thing. And then the more I was researching it, it kind of dawned on me that this would make a really interesting body of work, a really interesting series of photographs, not so much just the bothies themselves, but exploring this community of strangers that meet in these buildings for 24 hours or less, have this sort of, I don't know, I guess a primitive experience of just sharing shelter and fire and food and good conversation before they disappear off into the mountains again and never talk. This idea had been kind of there, and as I was in my lunch breaks in the studio, I was kind of researching and becoming more and more obsessed about it, to the point where I just booked a trip, and I drove up to the Lake District and visited this bothy below the Honester slate mine called Warnscale. I had my first sort of bothy experience, and actually made the first image that later made it into the book. And then there began 2 to 3 years of working in a studio, booking off week at a time, 2 weeks at a time, driving up to the Highlands of Scotland or Snowdonia or the English lakes to hike to these bothies and meet strangers and try and understand a little bit about what this community was, and this sort of slightly what was new to me, a new story about the British landscape really. When I first started making work for Black Dots, it was primarily about the bothies. In very early days I realised that I can't really talk about the bothy story without including portraits and photographs of the people that I met along the way. As I'd neglected portraiture, I'd never photographed people before, so this was a huge, I guess, development for me in my photography, and a massive step away from, I was calling myself a landscape photographer. Was that the case anymore if 50% of my work is of people? I made this kind of rule that I would try my best to only make portraits of people that I'd met and shared the bothy with the night before. So I'd hike in, sometimes I wouldn't find there'd be no one there, and I'd have it for myself for 2 days, and I'd just spend 2 days trying to figure out maybe a still life or a landscape or wait for the right light. And sometimes you'd meet 2 or 3 interesting people, and you'd have an incredible night in front of the fire, and then the next morning I'd then introduce this idea of maybe I'm doing this thing, could I make a portrait of you? And 9 times out of 10, I think partly because you've had that experience with this person, but also I think that having the large format camera really helped, because they had never had their photograph taken on a camera like this before. Sometimes I just have to leave the camera out on a tripod and they would come to me, and then suddenly you're in then, and you've kind of you're trapped. So the portrait element was a huge part for me for the work, and actually ended up kind of, I guess, taking the lead. It stopped becoming about this is a project about bothies, and it became a lot about who these people are and why they would want to walk for sometimes 6 to 8 hours to sleep in a freezing cold shed with no power with a stranger. But there are over 100 bothies in the network that are maintained by the Mountain Bothy Association, which is this team of volunteers who maintain these buildings. And I didn't want to photograph every single one because I thought that would be like an incredibly boring series. So I kind of made a selection based off of the landscape these bothies were sitting in, how I could access them, were they by the beach, were they in a forest, were they in the mountains, would they look better in winter, how long is it going to take me to do this trip and that trip, and trying to fit that in around my rota in the studio. What I did is I bought a map of Scotland, and I put little red stickers on every single bothy and planned routes into every single one, and then from that kind of broke it down into that one's a little bit too similar to that one. So I was able to really hand pick maybe 20 to 25 bothies and locations that gave an honest cross section of mountain bothying in the UK. And also it had to cross seasons, it had to be an accurate representation of what it's like to experience the British landscape. And so not every single shot is bathed in golden light. I was very much embracing this idea of honest light, where I would shoot in what I was given. And that was helped by the fact that I would book a week off work and I kind of had to shoot in whatever I was given in that week. And so from those 20 bothies, I had this last one, Rivoan in the Cairngorms, that I was going to go and shoot. I made that final photo and I was walking back to the car and had sort of a 12-hour drive back to Devon. I decided on that drive home that I was going to quit my job. The job had served a purpose and it had given me a ton of experience working in a studio environment, which I'd kind of neglected whilst I was at university. I'd shot black dots and I was like, well, what do I do now? Why have I shot this? Is it just going to sit on a hard drive for however long and get a few Instagram likes and that's it? No, I want to put this out and I want people to kind of see it and then go, we get what this guy's about. And so I drove back and I handed my notice in the studio and almost took this leap of faith, and I put myself in a position where I had to make something work. Spent a few months marketing and pushing black dots and pushing the bothy work into every little corner of the internet that I could possibly find. And the work was received well, and I'm grateful for that. It ended up being released as a kind of small publication through Another Place Press. We ran a limited edition run of about 400 copies, backed by Rab, the sort of outdoor clothing company, and the marketing that gave me. We were able to sell out of the book in a month or so, and that gave me a huge, I guess, reassurance that okay, maybe I can make something of this, and maybe I don't need to cut out another football boot again. That said, I'm now freelance, and 50% of my time is spent working commercially for football orientated things, so I can't seem to shake the football thing. I managed to have this now healthy balance between working commercially on work that never goes near my website or never near my Instagram, stylistically looks incredibly different to anything that I would shoot personally, and I can balance that now with my editorial work and taking on personal projects. The Royal Photographic Society, they have these environmental bursaries, and over 30s and under 30s one every single year, and I entered Black Dots and pitched this new idea that I'd been sitting on for a while, and the environmental bursaries work in that if there's a project that has an environmental focus, then you pitch it to them with your portfolio, and then they give you £3,000 to go ahead and sort of start it off. I've been interested in this idea of rewilding for a while. The more that I read about rewilding and sort of the regeneration of wild spaces, the more I didn't get frustrated, but I kind of felt like the conversation was being diluted a little bit by this constant dialogue about the reintroduction of apex predators, like reintroducing wolves into here, there and everywhere, and I felt like there was a lot more to the rewilding story and to that story of wilderness conservation that deserved to be told and deserved to have more attention. And so my attention went to Romania, where a lot of rewilding initiatives talk about the reintroduction of species. Romania was less about reintroducing and more about preserving what they already have. So the Southern Carpathians, Romania in general, has one of the largest populations of European brown bear, lynx and wolf on the continent, the largest unfragmented forest, one of the last true wilderness areas in Europe. And this really interested me, and I was like, well, there's loads of little initiatives, rewilding initiatives happening there. And I found this organisation, Foundation Conservation Carpathia, who are working to build a brand new national park in the Southern Carpathians of Romania. That fascinated me, having grown up hiking and now living on a national park. In my experience, national parks are either there or they're not. That idea of creating one really fascinated me, and I was like, how do you build a national park? How is that possible? And so I pitched this idea to the Royal Photographic and was awarded their bursary, and then a few months later flew out in the winter and started making this work and embedded myself with this team of rangers from the organisation, and began trying to, I'm not an environmentalist, I'm not totally clued up on it, but photography allows me to put myself into places where I can learn about it, and present my findings through photography. I jumped in these 4x4s with the rangers, and I'd go out every day into the mountains and try and figure out, right, how do you build a national park? How is that possible? And at first I was just photographing portraits of rangers, landscapes of Romania. And I was like, well, this looks very nice, but it doesn't really talk about the thing I want to talk about. It just kind of looks like pictures of Romanian people. The more time I spent with the rangers, I realised that creating a national park there's not like 5 easy steps, and you don't see people physically constructing anything. It was more small groups of people doing tiny, seemingly insignificant tasks in a massive area over a long period of time, day after day after day. And so that became the approach that I took through stepping back from the rangers and kind of photographing them doing these tiny tasks. They become lost in this landscape, and you can't really tell what the rangers are doing or what they're working on, and it looks like they have this absolutely mammoth task ahead of them, and they're, you know, peering over a muddy puddle looking at a single footprint in this endless sea of trees or just a blanket of snow, and they're just trying to find a strand of hair. And that is reality. That is how they build enough data to convince the state that a national park would be beneficial for the wilderness areas in the Southern Carpathians. And so you've got this small team of rangers going out on this wildlife monitoring program covering thousands and thousands of hectares, picking up individual strands of hair, recording DNA samples, measuring footprints, picking up scat, taking urine samples every single day for years and years to come, until they build up this really accurate profile of the species in that area. And then through doing that, they're able to put forward a convincing argument to create a national park. And I've spent the last 18 months out in the Southern Carpathians on and off, like seasonal trips, coming back for editorial work, then flying back out, and then, you know, and just trying to sort of document the creation of a national park through the daily routines of this wildlife monitoring program. And that's taken me 18 months, and obviously they've been doing this for, FCC have been around for 10 years, and it's a long game, it's a long process. So this is something that I'll keep dipping in and out of whenever I can, and just keep this continual sort of archive of photographs about sort of the rebirth of European wilderness, if you like. One bit of advice that I could give myself or offer someone who is wanting to pursue photography, it would be embrace all opportunities, both pursuing personal projects and taking on commercial and editorial assignments. There's nothing to be ashamed of, by working to a strict brief or shooting things in a completely different way than you would like to shoot because it pays money. It is only through finding that balance and taking on that work that you are able to move forward as a photographer and to pursue those personal projects that you really want to shoot.